No one embodies the concept of being in the wrong place at the wrong time better than Japanese engineer Tsutomu Yamaguchi, the only officially recognized person to have witnessed two of the most powerful explosions in human history. Hiroshima, morning of August 6th, 1945. It was around 8 a.m. and there was 1 month left until the end of World War II. 29-year-old engineer Tsutomu Yamaguchi was finishing a 3-month assignment in Hiroshima, where he was working on the design of oil tankers for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. In the evening, he planned to take the train home to Nagasaki, where his wife and newborn son were waiting for him. All he had to do was pick up his hanko, a personal seal without which he could not obtain his travel documents. Yamaguchi had already left the shipyard when he remembered that he had left it on the table. He turned around and went back. When he reached the open area, he heard a low rumble in the sky. He looked up and saw an American B-29 bomber, and then he saw a small object slowly descending on 2 parachutes. Yamaguchi didn't know what it was. He only had time to take a step to the side. The next moment, there was a white flash so bright that it eclipsed the sun. He fell into the nearest ditch. A shockwave swept through the city, reducing buildings to rubble. Yamaguchi's ears were blocked. His eardrums burst, and the skin on his face and hands was burned. He was less than 2 miles from the epicenter, but he was still alive. Lying in the ditch meant waiting for death. So he got up and walked toward the shipyard to see if there was anywhere to return to. When he got up, the sky was darkened by dust. The city had disappeared under a layer of rubble. Tens of thousands of people died instantly. Yamaguchi could only check if his legs were moving. Then, slowly, with burns and torn ears, he headed toward the shipyard where he worked. The road through Hiroshima. As Yamaguchi began to move toward the shipyard, he saw that the city had virtually ceased to exist. Buildings had been reduced to their foundations. Trees lay uprooted. The streets were littered with the bodies of people who had died in the first seconds of the explosion. The skin on his hands and face was burned, his clothes were charred, and his hearing was almost gone. But he kept going, guided only by the ruins of what had once been familiar landmarks. After several hours, he reached the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries site. There, amid the ruins, stood 2 of his colleagues, Akira Iwanaga and Kuniyoshi Sato. Both were injured, but alive. They were the only people he knew whom he met that day. With no other option, the 3 men spent the rest of the day in an underground bomb shelter, waiting for dusk. After sunset, they decided to try to reach the train station, which was rumored to still be operating. The road was difficult. They saw burning neighborhoods, people wandering aimlessly in shock, and bodies lying on the side of the road. At one point, they came to a river where the bridge had been destroyed. To get to the other side, they had to wade through water filled with corpses, the result of the collapse of the structure. Finally, late in the evening, they reached the station. Despite the explosion, despite the destruction and chaos, the station miraculously continued to operate, and a crowded train departed for Nagasaki. The car was filled with dozens of people with burns similar to those of Yamaguchi and his companions. People in bandages, in torn clothes, with bandaged heads and burned hands. When the train finally started moving, the car was silent. Yamaguchi looked out the window and thought of only one city, Nagasaki. The train from Hiroshima to Nagasaki moved slowly. Many were silent. Others moaned in pain. It was an improvised evacuation train for those who could still move on their own. Tsutomu Yamaguchi arrived home the day after the explosion. The doors and windows of his house were intact. His wife and newborn son were physically unharmed. They lived in Nagasaki, a city that had been largely untouched by the war. For them, the story of the new bomb sounded like something distant. Yamaguchi was in serious condition. Burns on his face and hands, ruptured eardrums, general weakness and dizziness. He did not receive adequate medical care. The country's resources were depleted, and the healthcare system itself was barely functioning. His burns were bandaged with whatever was available, and he was left to rest at home. Meanwhile, U.S. President Harry Truman's statement was spreading in Tokyo and other cities. In it, he officially took responsibility for the use of a new weapon against Hiroshima and warned that if Japan did not surrender, it would face a reign of ruin, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. These words were broadcast on the radio and in the press. For many Japanese, they remained abstract. Not for Yamaguchi. He saw the result of this reign with his own eyes. He understood that other large cities were at risk and that Nagasaki could theoretically be the next target. Despite his condition, on the morning of August 9th, he decided to go to work at the local branch of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries in Nagasaki. There were several reasons for this. In wartime, absence from work without an official explanation could have consequences. He wanted to report to management on the real extent of the destruction in Hiroshima. The company's structure continued to function, and he was still formally expected to do something. Yamaguchi arrived at the factory with his head and hands bandaged. His colleagues saw his burns, but few understood what had happened to him. He was allowed into the branch manager's office. There, he tried to explain what he had seen. A single bomb had destroyed Hiroshima. Not massive bombing, not a series of raids, but a single explosion that had effectively wiped the city off the map. The manager did not believe him. According to witnesses, he reacted irritably, saying that Yamaguchi was exaggerating, that one bomb cannot destroy an entire city, and that he must have lost his mind from the experience. This discussion lasted several minutes. Yamaguchi stood in the office, trying to calmly explain that this was not emotion, but fact. He had seen a huge pillar of fire and ruins, stretching for tens of kilometers. At that moment, they heard a low rumble in the sky. The conversation was interrupted. Both looked out the window. In an instant, everything around them changed. August 9th, 1945, Nagasaki. It was around 11 a.m. when Tsutomu Yamaguchi stood in the Mitsubishi director's office and tried to explain for the second time that one bomb could destroy an entire city. At 11:02, the same white light flashed over Nagasaki. The second atomic explosion in 3 days. The shockwave shattered windows and broke frames. Walls shook. Furniture was overturned. Yamaguchi, who was standing closer to the epicenter of the flash, fell to the floor. Unlike in Hiroshima, he was now inside a building which partially protected him from direct heat radiation. The director and employees who were closer to the windows were seriously injured. Yamaguchi heard screams, but he himself was in shock. His body had not yet recovered from the first burns when the shock wave swept over him again. He got up and looked around the office. Glass, debris, injured people. The manager, who a minute ago had called him crazy, was lying among the debris and asking for help. Yamaguchi, in his own words, ignored his cries. He turned around and climbed out through the broken hole where the window used to be. He had only one thought in his mind: to get home. In a matter of seconds, the city was reduced to ruins. Part of Nagasaki was destroyed. Buildings were burning and the streets were littered with wounded people. Yamaguchi, still burned from Hiroshima, now had additional injuries from the second explosion, but he was moving toward his neighborhood. When he reached his home, he saw that the house was damaged. The windows were broken, but the structure had remained intact. His wife took their baby and took him to a nearby concrete shelter, precisely to show the child what a shelter looks like if Nagasaki were to be bombed. This chance departure from the house, made a few minutes before the explosion, saved their lives. Yamaguchi found them alive. His wife and child had only suffered cuts from glass and minor injuries. After that, he lost consciousness. He spent the next few days between life and death. High fever, infected burns, general weakness. There were practically no hospitals left that could provide adequate care. Much of the medical infrastructure had been destroyed. Treatment consisted of bandaging, improvised remedies, and waiting. When Yamaguchi finally regained consciousness, almost a week had passed. On August 15th, 1945, Japan officially announces its surrender. For most people, the war is over, but questions about how it ended remain unanswered to this day. Since then, historians, lawyers, and eyewitnesses have returned again and again to the same dilemma. Does Japan's earlier surrender justify the mass deaths of civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Were these strikes a necessary evil? Or, on the contrary, unnecessary acts of cruelty that should be considered war crimes? A little-known fact: at the time of the bombings, the U.S. had several more atomic bombs ready. and was only waiting for President Truman's decision to continue the series of strikes. 2 days before Japan's surrender, Washington was still considering the possibility of new attacks. If these bombs had actually been dropped, it would have been much more difficult to argue that the mass destruction of civilians was a necessary part of the war. The modern view of the US's role in ending World War II could have been very different. The long-term consequences make this debate even more acute. The effects of radiation did not end in August 1945, nor a year later, nor 10 years later. They affected the health of the children and grandchildren of those who survived. Cancer, organ failure, chronic diseases associated with radiation exposure in the first days after the explosion. The story of Tsutomu Yamaguchi is just one example of how these decisions looked from below, from the perspective of one family that was twice in the zone of a nuclear strike and paid for it, with the health and lives of their loved ones for decades. After Japan's surrender, Tsutomu Yamaguchi's life formally returned to peacetime. In fact, he was a man who had survived 2 nuclear explosions. He lost hearing in his left ear. His burns took a long time to heal, and he suffered from one infection after another. Years later, he still wore bandages, and the scars on his skin reminded him of August 1945 every day. The effects of radiation were not limited to him. His son, who was an infant in Nagasaki during the second explosion, lived his entire life with the effects of early radiation exposure. He died of cancer at the age of 59. Doctors attributed this to the effects of radiation in childhood. Yamaguchi's wife lived a long life, but her body gradually deteriorated. She died at the age of 88 from kidney and liver failure, which was also attributed to the effects of radiation exposure after the bombing. Yamaguchi himself faced new problems in his old age. He developed cataracts and acute leukemia, typical diseases for people who have survived significant doses of radiation. Despite this, he lived to be 93 and died in 2010 of stomach cancer. His story is an example of how a nuclear attack does not end on the day of the explosion. It continues for decades in the form of illness, premature death, and the slow destruction of the bodies of survivors. In Yamaguchi's case, this meant the loss of his son, his wife's long illness, and his own battle with cancer at the end of his life. In post-war Japan, people who survived Hiroshima or Nagasaki were officially called hibakusha. This was not just a term, it was a status that entitled them to state support, monthly payments, and free medical care. Initially, Tsutomu Yamaguchi was officially considered a victim of the Nagasaki bombing only. What happened to him in Hiroshima remained formally outside the system for a long time, even despite the obvious facts. Yamaguchi himself did not insist on this immediately, received treatment, and tried to live a normal life as far as possible. Only later did he decide that his story should be officially recorded. One of the reasons was his desire to tell younger generations the real story of the atomic bombings, not in abstract terms, but through the personal experience of someone who had seen both explosions. In January 2009, Yamaguchi applied for dual recognition. In March of that year, the Japanese government officially granted him hibakusha status for both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, making him the first formally recognized man to have survived both attacks. In later interviews, he was repeatedly asked about his attitude toward the bombings. He responded directly. The US could have made its political gesture by dropping one bomb. In his opinion, the second was not a military necessity, but a rush to demonstrate technological superiority. He particularly emphasized that the American leadership was well aware that the targets would be women, children, and infants. He said that it would have been different if the weapon had been tested on a purely military target without a large number of civilians. Instead, densely populated cities were chosen. Today, he is often called the luckiest man in history because he was twice in the zone of a nuclear explosion and survived. But it would be more accurate to describe him as the unluckiest lucky man, a man who experienced what most people would never see even once.